season starts here, the Vancouver Boat Show.
Welcome to the Vancouver International Boat Show virtual seminar series, sponsored by Freedom Marine International Yacht Sales, the premier choice for exploring the passion of yachting. Thank you for joining us. This seminar will begin in 1 moment. If you're having technical difficulties, you can reach me, the online moderator, via the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions for the speakers can be added in the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your screen, and questions will be answered after the slide presentation. It is our pleasure to present a family of 4, then 5, on a 7-year loop around the Pacific with Max and Elizabeth Shaw. Over to you, Max and Elizabeth.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure for us to be here this afternoon at the virtual boat show and tell you a little bit about our family trip around the Pacific. Before we left, we would have passed for a relatively normal family. We were both in the Air Force. Max and I spent 23 years in the Air Force. We had 2 little kids. We had lived in Ottawa. We had lived in Victoria. We found ourselves posted to Halifax. Along the way, we had learned to sail on some of our postings. In fact, here in Victoria, we belonged to a sailing co-op because at that stage, there was no way we could have managed the work of a boat and the 2 children. But as I said, we found ourselves posted to Halifax, and this wasn't exactly the weather the night that we were finishing off a bottle of red wine. It was more like snow turning to rain, turning to freezing rain, like they've had there the last few weeks. And we started saying, we should go back to Victoria. Then we started saying, we should go back on a boat. And once that idea was out there, it was obvious we should go back on a boat via the South Pacific. And that's pretty much, once that idea was expressed, what had to happen. And 2.5 years later, that's what we did.
Of course, now by this point, the idea had set hold. We'd had our boat, our house on the market. We'd gotten rid of most of our things. We told our worker we were leaving and we needed a boat. We both worked in requirements management at various times. So we started looking at what did we need? Well, we needed a sturdy offshore boat. We needed a boat that was going to be sturdier than us. We would be the weak point, not the boat. We also had 2 children and we were hoping for a 3rd. So we needed a boat that was going to be a good home. So ideally 3 cabins. And then if you're looking at this as a Venn diagram, that 3rd requirement would be we could afford it. And then the overlap became more of a data point. And we were then looking for a Stevens 47. We looked at all the ones that were available and then bought Fluenta on the West Coast in 2012. Fluenta needed a lot of work. We kind of underestimated how much work. We underestimated how reliable the contractors would be with us 4 time zones away. And then finally, perhaps our biggest failing that first year, we underestimated our efficiency while living aboard with 2 small children. Thankfully, we had a deadline. We had booked to do the Baja Haha Rally, leaving out of San Diego for Mexico, and we were determined to get there on time, on target. The trip down the West Coast, well, we made it. Now we can somewhat laughingly call it the mechanical failure tour of the West Coast. A lot of the new things we'd put in, the rigging, the steering, fridge, freezer, windlass, all had sorts of issues, and we had massive contamination in our fuel tanks, lots of lessons learned, of course, and some of the worst weather we'd had in our 7 years of our travels. But eventually we made it to Mexico. And you see the picture down in the bottom left corner, that's Chacala. This is the first time we really felt like we were cruising. This was the stuff out of Cruising World or Sail magazine. Sitting under a palapa with the boat at anchor, kids doing homeschool, maybe doing some surfing, a beer later with our new friends. Like, finally, we've made it. But there were a few quotes that kind of got us on our toes. You know, Daddy, the high water alarm is going off again. Daddy, what's that burning smell? And my concern of why is the rig always out of tune? So we realized that we had to stop moving and fix the boat. We couldn't deal with the 10, 15 years of neglect, plus all the things that just come up from using your boat 24/7. So this became our new reality. On the right there, we are replacing a bulkhead in Mexico. And then there was another twist to the plan. It was time to have a baby.
And as Max had said, this baby had been part of the realm of the possibilities, shall we say, since we left. And he came in Mexico. We found a doctor there who did water birth out of a house. And that was exactly what I was looking for, a couple minutes from a hospital. If, things had gone badly, they didn't. It was beautiful. And then getting ready for a baby on a boat is very similar to getting ready for a baby at home. You need a car seat for him. Oftentimes, not so much because we had a car, but because that gave us a safe place to secure him if we needed all hands to do evolutions. We needed cloth diapers. We didn't want to bring disposables across the Pacific, and various wraps and carriers so we could still get on with the jobs that needed to be done. And the first question when we found out we were expecting, Max asked me, am I sure? Yes. Can we still go? Yes. And so we got a hold of a friend of ours who came to crew with us across the Pacific, and we started provisioning up. And when Benjamin was 4.5 months, we took off across the South Pacific. You can see there, we actually counted up how many meals we thought we would have from when we would leave groceries in Mexico and see groceries again in Papeete, and just stocked as much as we possibly could fit into every nook and cranny.
Mexico was really good for us. We weren't new to sailing. We chartered. I was teaching at the advanced cruising level. I'd done some offshore racing, including a Bermuda race. But we'd never owned a boat and we'd never cruised long term. So there was lots of lessons for us on repairing boat or doing the maintenance, doing the provisioning. One of the key ones for us, especially after 23 years in the forces, was that the schedule was optional, and we reinforced several times that a schedule is perhaps the most dangerous thing on a boat. And we started to take some of our lessons from our professional lives of how we did risk management and started to apply that risk management to our cruising. It was a good passage, Mexico to the Marquesas of French Polynesia, 21 days, about 3,000 miles. We had a great sail. We only motored for about 7. And as Liz mentioned, one of the things we did that was great advice from our friends on Totem was to bring a third adult. So our friend Nancy came with us and just added a lot of sanity. So you can see there's us in Mexico, through the Northeast Trades, the Convergence Zone, and down to the Marquesas. So that's 3,000 miles. As we'll talk later, there's still another 4,500 to get to New Zealand.
So this was pretty much the passage that I had in mind when I said, sure, let's go across the Pacific. You've seen it all in the magazines: blue water, blue skies, white sails, parties at the drop of a hat. This is us celebrating crossing the equator with Nancy the first time. But what nobody told me was, first of all, I was postpartum. Second of all, it would have its moments of being gray and stormy. And I have to admit, by being caught off guard by the seasickness that sit in these sorts of conditions. But eventually the medication kicked in, and you can see there on the left, Benjamin and I stood a lot of watches, pretty much all our watches together. If Benjamin was awake, I was on watch. If he was asleep, I was off watch, steering with one hand, feeding with the other. You can see there the kids were always clipped in the cockpit. They've got their harnesses and their tethers. Even Benjamin, by the end of it, was sitting up, and he had his own little harness if he wasn't in the carrier with me. And here we are 3 weeks after leaving Mexico, heading into Fatu Hiva, one of the really famous French Polynesian anchorages. And then, of course, for Mom, it's back to work. We're putting all the netting up so Benjamin can have the run of the saloon, but keep him out of the nav station and the galley. Meanwhile, our 2 little bookworms are always nose in a book, and the baby sleeping in the Mexican hammock. And as Meg said, we're pretty proud of ourselves. We're 3,000 miles from Mexico. Only thing is, we have another 4,500 miles to go, and Nancy's flying home. So that after that, it was just the 2 of us, which pretty much meant Max single-handed, and I stood watches and as and when and kept the baby alive in between seasickness.
When we mention our adventure, we get a pretty much standard set of questions. One of our favorite ones is, did you bring your kids? Which we point out, well, yes, you can't just leave them in the house with a bowl of food and water. We get asked about pirates, and no, there were no pirates. Sharks is another favorite one. And as a farm boy, sharks were a bit of a shock for me. But we started to realize that they're just the sign of a healthy reef. We spent lots of time with sharks. That's me diving at the top right there in Whakarava with several hundred sharks, and Jonathan snorkeling with some in Morea. So only once out of our 7.5 years did we see a dangerous shark, which was this tiger shark here at Minerva Reef. You could see the anti-fouling on his nose where he was rubbing up against the boat. So we declined to sail or to swim that day. The food was another great adventure. On the left, you see Benjamin having one of his first coconuts. And on the right, you see a young Jonathan with a kitchen knife trying to open a coconut. That was a multi-hour activity. Now he is our designated coconut guy. He's just as fast as the locals up a tree with his machete and has coconuts open all around, which opens folks' eyes in the village when they see, a Canadian kid doing that. Again, more adventures in food. Here the kids are helping find pawpaw in the Marquesas. On the right, the park ranger poached some coconut crabs that we got to share in Saguaro. And playing with our toys. So again, Fakarava on the left, and iconic Bora Bora. We were anchored just off the resort. We were playing with the kids' sailing dinghy. I think we were having a lot more fun than the folks staying in the fancy hotels there ashore. We also started to realize that we wanted to stray from the pack just a little bit. So we took this kind of flyer up to Penryn in the Northern Cook Islands. And it was there we realized that it wasn't just about the beautiful beaches, but it was about the people. So Ria and Kula, the couple you see here, adopted us as soon as we anchored off their village of about 50 people. And whenever people ask us, do we want to join them on an adventure, lobster fishing or tuna or whatever, we always say yes. In this case, they asked us, did we want to go camping? Of course we did. Well, we didn't know, and it turned out all perfectly fine, but we actually brought these 16 kids and the 2 adults and these 2 aluminum boats on the camping trip to a more remote part of the atoll. So a bit interesting at times, but an amazing adventure. From there, we're down to Niue. And, it's very easy in the blog and in these presentations just to show pictures of pretty beaches and kids having fun. But there was the constant reminder to stay vigilant. This is the keel of an Amel that sunk a few weeks before we were there in Saguaro and the Cook Islands. And it was just that constant reminder that you needed to stay vigilant. You didn't have that comfortable safety blanket of the developed world there. You were very much on your own to ensure your safety and reliant on your other peer sailors around you. Our first season in the Pacific was amazing. It definitely met the brochure. It met the years of reading of cruising magazines. Beautiful islands and warm welcome. And of course, traveling with children, and especially a baby, means you're so well received. We also kind of got that inkling that it was good to stray from the pack a bit. And it reinforced that the boat and the crew needed to be ready. Sailing around here in the Gulf Islands, it's hard to comprehend the wear and tear on a boat when you're sailing 24/7. You're sailing with a constant sea state of at least 2 meters. It's just wears out the boat parts faster. As well, the limited resupply. There are places for provisions where there's people, there's also food, but boat parts are a lot harder. There are some places to ship parts in, but you're going to pay a pretty penny, and you're going to have to be waiting for quite a while for the stuff to come in. So it was a good reminder for us that the boat and crew needed to be ready.
So as we said, 3,000 miles to French Polynesia, another 4,500 in various segments took us to New Zealand. And then once you're in New Zealand, you're kind of in a place where you can go back and forth to the tropics. And that's what we found ourselves doing over the next couple of years. Cruisers need to be out of the cyclone belt, same as there's hurricanes in Mexico. There's a certain season to cruise the islands. And then about a week or so at sea takes you back down to New Zealand, provisioning, that kind of thing. So that's what we ended up doing. And you can kind of see here, you've got New Zealand on the bottom, and then this whole range of islands about a week and a half away, where you can spend about 6 months of the year exploring them. So we did do some traveling and exploring in New Zealand. You see Benjamin there, a couple of years older, looking down from a bit of a hike. The photo on the right, we anchored in Auckland Harbor and had a front row seat for the Volvo Ocean Race. So that was pretty fun, anchoring for free and seeing those boats. But most of it was the workaday side of fix the things that had broken, get the spare parts that we needed from the cruising season. Thankfully, that was the one time that we were in our life raft, was when we got it tested. They blew it up so we could see it. And then, as I said, back up to the islands. We saw Fiji in our second season. We had kind of skipped Tonga. We found all our friends were going to Fiji, and so we decided we would do that at another time, and it was extraordinary. There were half a dozen kid boats. We had gotten to know them all over the season in New Zealand, and it was just great. We kind of went like a herd, anchorage to anchorage. The first thing that happens when you show up in a Fijian village is you'll be invited to participate in a Sevu Sevu ceremony. So you see the picture in the bottom right there. What you bring as a guest is a bundle of this dried root called kava. That's presented eventually to the village chief. It's received with a ceremony in Fijian with plenty of words you don't understand and clapping of hands. Then it's pounded, and very likely it will be mixed with water, poured into the big bowl that you see there in the middle photo, and passed around in the half coconut shells as a ceremony of inviting you and welcoming you, making you a part of the village. We loved this because it was a chance to meet the people. It was also a chance to find out were there any rules we needed to follow? Was there anything that we could participate in or help to fix? And just a way to be welcomed as a part of the village. And even without Sevu Sevu, once we were there, if there was a feast, we would be invited. And if you look, I'm surrounded at that table on the floor, at the mat on the floor by all the men. The men would eat first. We would be with them, then the women and the children. And then on the right, the washing up would happen. And I have to say that washing up period was generally my favorite part, because you just were able to pitch in and help and chat with the women and start to hear some of their stories. All that food had to come from somewhere, and the lovely thing in Fiji is there's always a market that you can get fresh, colorful, juicy fruits and vegetables. On the right, you see the one of the markets in one of the atolls that we went to later, much slimmer pickings. And then finally, sometimes the market came to us. The man came in his kayak to bring us some fruits and veg. After people ask us about sharks, their next question is, what about our kids? How did they socialize? As I mentioned, the kid boats tended to congregate, even change their plans so that they could cruise together. And so we were often in an anchorage with several kid boats. They would organize their own program. You see there on the left, they've all been camping ashore. They were several days camping, just coming back to the boat or radioing us, asking for maybe a resupply of lunch or water or whatever, but they made their own program. On the right, the village came to us. We were in a bit of a more remote anchorage. They came and they cooked us an entire Fijian feast right there on the beach. This place where we were was called Fulanga, and it had only opened to cruisers a couple of years before that. So we were one of the first to go and visit. And each boat that came was assigned a host family who welcomed them. And that's our family there on the right. Of course, that little baby had a lot of diapers. I mentioned them earlier. And so cruising for a lot of people may well be maintenance in exotic locations. When you have a baby, it's also diapers in exotic locations. Hands in gloves, hands in the dish bucket or in the diaper bucket. So the calling card of a baby on board is the diapers on the lifelines. But every now and again, I would get away from the diapers and the children, and this would be my happy place, is just putting down my yoga mat on a beach. And this is a view of one kind or another that I saw many, many times. I had my podcasts from a teacher here in BC, and I just would practice on my own there on the beach as much as I could. Or if there was no beach, I would practice in the boat. There's exactly enough space in the saloon to lay down a yoga mat. Now, one of the things about cruising is you find yourself outside your comfort zone. And for many people, this would be their happy place on a kiteboard. But for me, this was a stretch. And so that smile was 2 years in the making. But this is kiting in Fiji, and it was pretty extraordinary.
One of the other sports we took up while we were there, especially when we were cruising with our Californian friends, was spearfishing. It became a great source of food, and along with the kite surfing, became one of our determining factors on where to anchor. The fish on the right I shot, and we actually gave to the village, gave them a photo of it, and we went back to that same village a year later, and it was still up in the chief's house. After going back and forth between New Zealand and the tropics a few times, we realized we wanted to stray a little further away. And one of the options to avoid cyclones, instead of going south, is to go north of the equator, where it's a different seasons. So that year we headed up from New Zealand to Fiji, up to Tuvalu, Kiribati, and then the Marshall Islands. Very rarely visited, extraordinarily friendly, very pristine. The World War II is right there in front of you. The kiteboarding has to be world class. The downside is it's a lot further. You get to go through 2 convergence zones. There's no chandleries, boat yards. There's pretty much no support. And for us, the biggest issue is less boats with other kids. At this point, we're not doing lovely downwind, trade wind sailing. Here we are, hard on the wind, heading up to Kiribati. One of the interesting things at this point is we realized the kids were older and so much more capable crew, really full crew, that there was no requirement to bring a third adult on the longer passages. They were standing their own watches, helping with navigation, whatever needed to be done. They were full crew. I do have to add the caveat, because I showed this picture one time and somebody asked, did we bring a GPS? And yes, like everybody else, we had multiple GPS, but we thought it was important that the kids learned some traditional navigation as well. Here we are in Tuvalu. We don't always look quite so polished, but we're just coming back from church, and you can see see Fluenta in the background there. From there up to Tarawa and Kiribati, the site of the Battle of Tarawa, one of the first large amphibious operations in World War II. It was also quite the social studies experience for the children to see what happens when you take people out of the peaceful village settings and put them into a large city with a cash economy with no cash. And that was really their first close-up encounter with slums. From there, we went up to Batari Tari. Only about 3 boats visit Batari Tari in a year, if that. Again, so much history all laid around. You'll see this World War II photo on the right of the flying boat. Well, that's still there as a wreck, and you can see Fluenta in the background. At high tide, I could paddleboard over it. We were very much welcomed to Batari Tari. Language was a bit of an issue, but what we always would find is if we found the teacher or the head teacher, their English was usually better. And our friend Ari, who was the head teacher there, adopted us. This is one of his houses on the right. That's their traditional accommodation. That's where they live. It's still very rustic. Having kids is always an icebreaker. Having kids that do handicraft and open coconuts and do all that stuff definitely was an icebreaker. Wherever Victoria went, she had her bag of handicrafts, and the ladies and girls would all come out and participate. And she would teach them some of what she was doing, and often that they would teach her a bit of their traditional handicrafts. People asked, do we do any fishing? Well, we don't have anything fancy like rods or reels. We just have hand lines, and we're a bit industrial about it. But there's the sailfish we caught just before Tuvalu on the left. And then on the right, when we had our friends from Batari Tari over for dinner, they brought some fish. So Victoria and Ari's daughter are preparing some fish.
And then finally, 2 convergence zones and quite a number of islands later, we reached the Marshall Islands. And this was a beautiful place. We loved it very much. And you can see the color there. It just, you don't get tired of being surrounded by turquoise. Of course, there are the usual contrasts between the capital and Majuro and its crowdedness and the outer islands. But again, some of the best kiteboarding and spearfishing in the world. So this is sometimes the view in Majuro in the harbor, is these big tuna boats that are coming and going out to do commercial fishing. So it was good. We could receive mail, packages, logistics, supplies. As Mag said, no chandlery, but one hardware store. So there was some provision. We would do that. But then as soon as we could, this is what we were escaping to. This was about 3 days against the wind to get to Ayaluk Atoll, and we spent as much time here as we could. Part of why we chose this atoll is they actually still use their traditional Marshallese sailing canoes to go up and down the atoll. So no, there was one boat with an outboard engine in the entire atoll, and the rest was all these sailing canoes. And if we were anchored in between the 2 villages, those were going back and forth on a daily basis, laden down with provisions, coconuts, supplies, that kind of thing. Pigs for a feast would grow on a different island, and they would go by us in the boat, in the canoe. I mentioned earlier the markets and the lack of things that grow in the atolls. You can kind of see from the beautiful white sand on the left why that might be. There is just nothing fertile to speak of the soil of these atolls. They grow coconuts and they grow these pandanus, which are there on the right. And this lady, Darlene, we spent quite a lot of time with her. She would have 5 or 6 different ways that she served pandanus to us. When we got to other islands after this, they don't even eat pandanus. They feed it to their pigs only. But here, it's the only thing that grows. And so these ladies have become very creative in ways to prepare it. Beside the pandanus and the coconut, there will be plenty of fish. They go spear fishing and then just cook them right there on their fire. You see the giant clam there. They do eat those, but more as a delicacy, as a treat. It was shared with us once, and we enjoyed it, but not necessarily our favorite. I mentioned earlier making something from nothing when it comes to the cooking. Same thing applies to the handicrafts. These ladies make these extraordinary, intricate, and detailed weavings, and all from the handful of plants that grow there on the atoll, making all the different colors, everything. So what we did is we went ashore one day with a dinghy load of stuff. When I provisioned up leaving Majuro and I filled the entire starboard bench with stacks of rice and flour, Max wasn't necessarily enthusiastic, but what it meant was we could go ashore, trade for the handicrafts, and then come back with a suitcase of those to bring back to Canada with us. People ask us about schooling for our kids. Some of it looked like what you see there on the left with the children at the dining room table. You kind of see the scowly face in the middle kind of exemplifies their opinion of that kind of schooling. Far more of the children's learning happened side by side with the people in the villages and other cruisers and so on, life as it met them. When we showed up in Iluk, it was actually Education Week, a week celebrated across the whole country. And so we were invited to participate in the festivities, invited to speak at their opening ceremony, come and visit the school and show them where we had come from and where they lived on the globe, and then visit some of the beaches.
So the aviation side of it was fascinating for me. My professional background's aerospace. At one point, I was an executive director of an aviation museum. And to have all of these aviation artifacts just right there was amazing. If this was Western Europe, they'd all be carted off. On the left, we asked the kids here where the Japanese airfield was, and they took us to show us the aircraft that are still sitting there, Japanese Zeros, ammunition, all sorts. On the right is an engine from a B-25, an American bomber. We put this on our blog, and a few weeks later, we actually had an email saying this had been one of the aircrew that died in the crash had been one of his uncles. Beyond school and social studies, we also got to play with our toys. You can see on the left here, we weren't anchoring too far from the kite surfing spots. We used a lot of satellite imagery to determine where we were going to kite and then figure out, could we anchor near those spots?
So by now we've been gone from home 5 years. We had said when we left, we'd go for a few. We didn't know how many. And it was starting to feel like enough years on the far side of the date line. Maybe it was time to start heading back towards Canada. So what we decided to do in our usual roundabout way was head from the Marshall Islands back to New Zealand, up to Alaska, and then to Canada. This gave us a chance to visit the countries we had missed in the South Pacific. It gave us a chance to add a furnace to Fluenta and do some other preparations for being up here in the cold, and just a chance to extend that trip a little bit longer.
When we started plotting the return from from the Marshall Islands to Vanuatu, I looked and there was an island group, which of course is one of those things you want to not hit on a passage. And I looked more closely and it was Tikopia, which I remember reading about in Jared Diamond's books Collapse. So we definitely had to see if it was feasible to stop. Not a lot of information. If you look at the right, that's the best chart I could find. Even the satellite imagery wasn't very good. But we did ask around. We found out somebody had gone there, that we would be likely welcomed. And so it just became a good example of how you need to be conservative in these environments. So we timed our arrival for daylight. After you've been at sea for a week, you're really keen just to get going or to stop. In this case, we still had to hove to for a while, wait for a little better light. We then anchored out in the deep, and then we do our own little survey. We go in with our tender and a handheld GPS and depth sounder and make sure we've got a safe place to anchor, and then we move further in. Unfortunately, the year after we were there, a Canadian boat went in, and we're not exactly sure what happened, but they got disorientated in the anchorage and ended up on the reef, and that was the end of their trip. This is the typical Tikopian boat. So this gentleman came out to welcome us, to do some trading. They very rarely get any cruising boats coming by, so we had lots of visitors, which was just great. Their traditional accommodation, this is what the houses look like. They do have a few solar panels, but very simple. We'd done some aid work in Fiji after a big cyclone there, and they'd recently had a cyclone here, and we'd asked if they needed any help, and it was really heartening. Their answer was, well, no, of course, we're in the Pacific, we get cyclones, we're prepared, we deal with it, and we move on. They did ask for some help in some of the technical things. We did end up working on a lot of generators and electrical systems and solar panels and outboards. So on the left, you see him trying to fix that inverter. What you can't see in the photo is the whole hut is full of men watching me work, not just a little bit of stress. And then on the right, Liz is fixing the sewing machine. From there, we're down to Vanuatu. I remember reading National Geographic as a child and reading about the Nagal, the land diving. And we were lucky enough to be there in the season that it's actually done. It's only for a small period of the year that the vines are appropriate, because it's not rope, it's vines. I always thought that the vines stopped them before they hit the ground, but as you can see with this poor fella on the right, they do hit pretty hard. And again, Vanuatu is just a magical place. The dancing, here I'm wreck diving on the President Coolidge. And then you have to like the laxer health and safety standards, as you could, I guess, put it. At the volcano, the guide was saying, If there's molten lava flying towards you, don't turn around and run, because you need to be able to watch it to dodge it. So I can't imagine getting approvals to do that here. From there, we caught up to a bunch of our friends in New Caledonia. Again, do some kite surfing, play with our various toys, and then back to New Zealand. Mostly for maintenance, also some travel. You can see in the center there, Liz is the headmistress overhauling our toilets, but the kids are getting much more mature. So Victoria helping clean the propellers, and on the left, Benjamin now able to go up and down the ladders. Perhaps the most dangerous thing we did in our 7 years of travel was living in a boatyard.
So that brought us down to New Zealand on our trip ready to head back to Canada. You can see there, New Zealand is at the very, very bottom of this globe, and over the course of that following year, all the way up to Alaska and around to British Columbia, 11,300 nautical miles. And our first stop was finally Tonga. We had headed for Tonga that several years earlier, realized all of our friends were in Fiji, turned in the night and headed for Fiji instead, and now we're finally in Tonga. And let me tell you, swimming with these humpback whales was probably one of the highlights of the 7 years of our trip. They come to Tonga to have their calves. They come back to the same little nooks in the same atolls every time they calve, so the local tour guides know who to expect and when to expect them, and they're very regulated and made sure that we kept our proper distance. But it was just absolutely magical to be there close enough just to watch them and swim with them. Not everything we swam with was quite as big as a humpback whale. Here's one of the kids free diving down to take a look at this leopard shark. These are nocturnal, which means they swim around in the night and they lie around in the day waiting for their photos to be taken. So we were happy to oblige. On the left, a little bubble making Jonathan. And on the right is Mom once again outside of her comfort zone. This is now breath hold diving, coming into an underwater entrance into a cave in Tonga. The kids by this time were big enough to constantly be spearfishing with Max, and thankfully able to fillet their catch once they've been out from swimming. Tonga, once again, a little more kite surfing. By now, the kids are getting big enough to have a go. We did eventually get them some proper lessons, but that's Max and Victoria having some fun in the early days. And then again, more often than not, a smile in my face on the kiteboard, especially in conditions like this.
So our plan was to take a more traditional route up to the Marshall Islands, then Federated States of Micronesia, through Guam to Japan, and across to the Aleutians. But by the time we got up to the Marshalls, we realized that we actually just really loved the Marshall Islands. We wanted to spend more time in our favorite kite surfing spots. We wanted to spend more time with our friends in the villages. We also realized that the boat really needed some more work before that big passage. So it was a shorter passage, or shorter overall miles, but quite a significant passage to go from the Marshall Strait to the Aleutians. But before we did that, we had a time to go back and visit our friends. So back with Darlene, with Victoria, sharing handicrafts, back in the village for a feast, back into the school. It's fun at this point. Benjamin's at 2 years older, so he's able to interact more in the school. And of course, more spearfishing. Somebody would ask us, what type of fish is that? We'd say it's lunch fish. And then the kiting. We picked one of these spots specifically for teaching the kids. And of course, the local proa sailing canoes would always stop by to see how we were doing. This is one of our favorite spots. I picked this one purely from the satellite imagery, and we spent weeks and weeks here just kiting. So that's me on my kiteboard there. On our way out of the Marshalls, we stopped in Rongerik. It was something out of a novel. It's never been inhabited. The Marshallese think it's haunted, so nobody goes there. So the reaction from the animals, the wildlife, is just crazy. These booby birds follow us everywhere. They get incredibly close. Another day we were out walking the beach and we saw the fresh tracks from the turtle. It was full moon, so they'd been laying their eggs. We went snorkeling on a new reef that day, and I saw in the distance something coming straight towards me, and still a bit of a farm boy from BC. We'd had a bit of an issue with some sharks, so we're a little more curious than we wanted them to be earlier in the day. I was like, okay, what's next? Well, it was this turtle came right up to me, stopped, as you can see, quite close, looked me in the eye, and then carried on. It was just quite the experience, sort of being checked out to see if I was a threat or not. Less inspiring, more of a threat, was all this garbage we saw on the windward side. All this plastic is not coming from the Marshallese or the other Micronesians. This is all on the windward side of these countries, so this is coming from the Americas. But then we were back to Majuro. It was time to get ready for our trip. By this point, we'd done a lot of passages, but out of all of them, this was the most serious. We actually, about 2 years earlier, started with historical weather data and using simulations just to figure out the best time of year, the best route. We spent a lot of time making sure the boat was ready, that everything was rebedded, making sure our safety gear and completing our drogue and sea anchors worked properly, and even going to the extent before the passage itself was removing the anchor. Of course, after 7 years in the tropics, our clothing pretty much consisted of shorts and t-shirts and swimsuits, and not really appropriate for the Aleutians. So at that point, we started to panic a bit that we needed warm clothing ×5.
And so I got on the internet. We were in Majuro, which has US Postal Services, which is one of its features, and started looking around for merino wool clothing. Came across a company that said, if you're out there doing something adventurous, we'd love to sponsor you with some gear. So I called them up and said, hey, we're a family of 5 sailing from Micronesia to Alaska on a sailboat. Is that adventurous enough for you? And the woman kind of laughed and chuckled, said, of course it was. And the next thing you know, there was a full set of thermal layers came in the mail for Max and myself, as well as toques and neck warmers, all the small layers for the kids. And so this company was Woolex, and even in the years since, they've been really good to give us the layers. The shirt I've got today is from them, and it's just beautiful merino wool clothing that's really stood us up well.
And of course, maintenance or cruising being maintenance in exotic locations. Here's Liz relaxing on Mother's Day. On the left, yet again, rebedding the tow rail. The kids are a big help, just making sure all the ports and just keep the water out, especially as it was going to become colder and colder water. You'll be relieved to know I am wearing clothing on the picture on the right. Things people sometimes ask, well, what do you do all day? And we explain that, sometimes even the simple things take a while. So fueling is a full day activity because there's no fuel docks. We motor for over a mile to the garbage dump here, walk for a while down the road to the gas station, fill up jerry cans in the tropical heat, and go back to the boat, pour that in. So something like that takes a whole day when you need 14 jerry cans worth of diesel to prepare for the trip north. Of course, we also checked our survival equipment. In this case, you can imagine we didn't wear this very long in that heat. And then it was time to head north. So if you look at the little chartlet here, you can see we're starting at the green circle. We want to get up to the little purple happy face. To put these distances in context, we're somewhere likely around the red dot if you're in Victoria or Vancouver. The Southeast Alaska that people talk about going to is only as far as where my cursor is. So it's not just to put it all in perspective. Kind of 3 phases. Phase number 1 is to get up through the trade winds, so the strong northeast trade winds. Then we've got to get through the doldrums or the horse latitudes without using all our diesel. And then 3, we get up into the variables where we've got to worry about all those gales coming out of Japan, heading up to the Bering Sea or the Gulf of Alaska. So an interesting passage.
So this is departing from Rongerik Atoll. So at this stage, we're 3 days out of Majuro. We've been here a week or so doing some last fixes and waiting for the weather to be just right. And what I really want you to notice about this is that's not actually me on the bow. I spent a lot of hours over the time that we were cruising on the bow, wearing the Bluetooth headset, pointing out bommies, which are never on the chart, so that Max could steer and avoid them. By this time, Victoria's old enough that she can do this, which means I can be downstairs, off watch that little bit earlier and getting the sleep before we head out into the conditions offshore. Because this is what we were facing by that same evening, is beating to or just close hauled for days going up through the trade wind, and rest was really important. The only saving grace in this particular instance is the water isn't cold yet. So it's sluicing along the deck and into the cockpit, but it's not making us super cold. And then into the doldrums. This is really what it looks like. It was 6 days of this kind of condition. We would get excited if we had gusts to 6 knots of wind because it meant we could fly the spinnaker. And of course, it was calm enough that if we did have any stitching that needed to be fixed, we could fix it right then and there. So there's Victoria stitching up part of our Dodger, and then she and I were putting some patches on our old spinnaker. And then, as Max said, all these storms come across from Japan, heading through Alaska and heading for North America. And our rum line took us straight across them. So what we had to do, download the weather several times a day. And then if there's black, badness, redness, you don't need to be a weather expert to say you don't want to go through that red and black mess. You sail east for 200 miles, 2 days, and then you come up through the yellow on the other side just to make sure that we kept everybody as safe as possible as we're traveling. And then the next thing you know, here we are, ready to make landfall in the Bering Sea. The boys are wearing every layer that they own. Jonathan's reading Willy Wonka to Benjamin. And then on the right, our crew is ready to get the dock lines ashore.
At first, we kind of thought Alaska was just going to be a way to get back to Canada. And then the more research we did, the more we realized we had a really amazing opportunity to go to the Aleutians and Prince William Sound, places that people don't normally get to go to. And so here's a picture of one of the local grizzlies where we were anchored in Prince William Sound. Here we are in Geographic Harbor. So we're anchored in 100 feet of water, and we can see the bears frolicking, or wrestling to be more accurate, on the beach. In this case, it was a little intimidating because the grizzly ended up between us and our tender and our boat, but such is cruising. Lots of ice on the left, Yale Glacier at Prince William Sound. We were there for a week. We saw one other boat in the distance, and every day we do trips to go watch the glacier calving, creating its little tsunamis, and of course our constant companions, whales of all sorts. Again, out on our toys, some paddle boarding. Liz even found a little chunk of stone to do some yoga on. But at this point, or after that point, we were pretty much in delivery mode. We were into Guayhanas in November. We were the only people in the park. We did get permission. The museum took great care of us. We had a private briefing, and we got to meet a bunch of the staff there. Really great folks. We had an awesome visit, despite it being November in Guayhanas. And then a picture people will recognize. We're home into Victoria. Just kind of shows our route, about 36,000 miles around the Pacific, and rather a few zigzags. We have various presentations we do on seamanship and other stuff, and we're not going to really go into that much today. But one of the key lessons for us was the risk management. I researched a lot of the accidents where boats were lost in the South Pacific, and so much of it came down to a lack of passage planning, not putting that time and preparation in to just reduce your risks. We also learned that the boat preparation was critical, and that, you know, if something was important, there needed to be redundancy. You needed to have a spare, a way to fix it, or a way to do without. Fatigue management, whenever you look at transportation studies, you see that tired people make more mistakes, and that leads to accidents. So that became critical for us in making sure that between the two of us, we worked well as a team, and with the kids worked well as a team, to ensure that we didn't get too fatigued on the longer passages. I have another presentation on this one, but I'll just go through this quickly. We get used to having really accurate charts around here. Here's a classic example. This is the Tuamotus. This looks fine. Not much to see here. If you focus down on this tiny little island there, you zoom in one notch, and wow, there's an entire atoll there. So zooming back out and zooming back in. So on this corner here, there's still a wreck of a ship where somebody didn't have the right charts or didn't zoom in and found themselves on the reef. Here we are plotting our way into Dakonimba in Fiji, plotting how we're going to get through that little channel. You overlay that onto the satellite imagery and you say, ooh, that wouldn't go so well because there's a datum error. And this one's actually not much of a datum error. We've seen them up to 1.5 miles. So it just means that you can use things like satellite imagery to help you, but the old Mark I eyeball, paying attention to where you're going, becomes your critical safety device. And of course, it's not just the South Pacific. Before we had a chart plotter, we just had this old Garmin, and here we are doing 7.7 knots, apparently over Isla Isabella.
So there's the seamanship side. The family side, some of the lessons learned are really what's it like to live with children, things about communication and so on. But of course, we've learned all those lessons in the tiny little tin can, in hot conditions. Everything is always moving. Everything needs to be lashed and stowed when it's time to go to sea. So we just had to learn to catch our breath, stop and breathe, don't overreact, that kind of thing. So plenty of time together, as anyone with children can imagine, and families, that can be a mixed blessing. So we also learned if somebody wanted to stay ashore, for instance, if we were going onto another boat, or stay on the boat when we're going ashore, we would let them do that. If someone needed space, we'd let them have it. I loved watching the kids rise to the challenges that presented themselves, but also have the chance to be children and just run and play and do things with other kids for so much longer. Because it's just very much that natural learning environment that life meets you and you roll with it. And I think the biggest lesson is on communications. And for anyone thinking of going offshore, I think shore up your communication skills before you go, because once you get there, you've got what you've got, and you just have to pull together, work as a team, and deal with things down the road. So communications are paramount. So overall, intense, but worth it, very much worth it. And then the last point is we've got 2 out of our 3 kids here. One of them is at work this afternoon. Now he's a teenager.
No.
But this is Victoria. She's now 17. She was 8 turning 9 when we left. And Victoria, we just want these people to hear what's your main recollection of cruising. What do you love, miss, whatever?
For me, what really stood out about cruising was the people and the connections we made. Because when you're cruising, you're all thrown together and you instantly have something in common and a connection with people. So you make friends very, very quickly. And people have compared the cruising community to being very similar to the pioneer community back in the day, where if there's a problem, people will all pitch in to try and help. And so I think that it was the people that really made cruising amazing for me. And I'm gonna step out and let my little brother in.
Benjamin's next.
We'll see what he has to say.
So this little person is the one, put on your knees, put on your knees. This little person is the one who was baby Benjamin in the beginning of the trip, and now he's 7-year-old Benjamin. And so Benjamin, all these people on the camera might like to know, what did you miss the most once you came back to Canada? What did you miss the most about cruising?
Coconuts.
Coconuts? Anything else that you missed?
Coconuts?
More coconuts?
What
You were
about the
telling
heat?
me the other day that you kind of missed swimming at a beach where it was warm,
Yeah, and not the freezing cold.
and not the freezing cold that we have here. And was there anything you didn't like about the tropics?
Socks.
Socks. So we didn't wear
And
socks. Heat
nice.
rash, maybe?
And I still don't like socks.
And you still don't like socks. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for talking to us.
And can I tell a joke?
One joke.
What do you call a Canadian chimpanzee?
What do you call a Canadian chimpanzee?
A chimpanzee.
Of course. There we go. So there you see the before and after of our trip. The first photo is our very first docking out of the hard stand when we took possession of Fluenta in Anacortes. The bottom photo is our arrival picture into Victoria, 36,000 miles, 14 countries, 7.5 years, and of course that one new baby later. And here we are.
And then people ask us, what's next? What's the next adventure? And to be honest, we don't really have an answer. Right now, the priority is high school for the 2 older kids. We started Fluenta Marine Services, and I'm quite busy working as a yacht broker for Yacht Sales West. And that's enough adventure for us at the moment, and then we'll see what the future brings. So I think at this point, we'll say that if people want more information, we do have a blog. I will be available for a lot on live chat through Yacht Sales West, and we can take some questions. So we'll go back to the webinar host just to see what questions there are out there.
Okay, so we have a question from Keith. Wonderful and inspiring trip. When is the best month to see the glaciers calf?
Well, that's a good question, Keith. And by the way, I walked by your boat. It's in great shape. Thanks. Really, the time that you're there, to be honest, we don't know. I mean, it's such a short period of time you can get there, especially in Prince William Sound. You don't want to get there too early, and you pretty much need to be across the Gulf of Alaska before the end of August. So there's not a lot of flexibility, but I'm not sure what the best time would be.
We were there mid-July till mid-August and arrived in the Aleutian Islands. I'll answer the second question first as well. It was 27 days from Rongerik to Dutch Harbor, and before the 27, it was 3 days from Majuro to Rongerik. So we arrived in Dutch Harbor the middle of July. We got to Prince William Sound, where we were watching all the glaciers the beginning of August, and we crossed the Gulf of Alaska the first week of September. So for us, it was the month of August that we were seeing all the glaciers. And then we can just answer some of these questions. Yep. And Maureen, there's another one. If we were to do it again or do more of it, would we do anything differently? And I guess that's really the question. If you were to live your life over, would you do anything differently? And I think for the most part, we have to say we loved what we did. We embraced challenges when they popped up. We learned early to not stick so rigidly to our schedule that we missed the best adventures. We made sure that we were provisioned up with supplies and spare parts, and as Max said, redundant systems. We did our best to keep speaking to each other. So I don't know that there's too much that we would change, but we would certainly make the most of every chance that it comes. That was maybe a lesson that we learned along the way, is leave the schoolwork for another day and just do what you can do that day.
Yeah. Perfect.
Question about seasickness.
Oh, that's a good one. I used to teach offshore sailing out of Halifax. I still teach a little bit here, but in Halifax, as soon as you leave the harbor, you're offshore. For us, really, well, I guess, and so much has been written about this, so there's lots of reading you can do. It's psychological and physiological. The main part is be comfortable, be confident in the boat, be confident in your crew, be confident in yourself, and then just do as much as you can to be gentle on your body, avoiding, caffeine and spicy food, no booze the night before, and just make sure that you've got the right amount of layers on. We found that there's certain medications that would work for us at certain times. So if we knew it was going to be rougher, just because we couldn't afford to be seasick, we would take those medications ahead of time, and you just find out what's appropriate for you. And like most things in life, just take it gently. Be kind to yourself, and
cook your food ahead. So I would, every passage we did was at least overnight, and many of them were 3 to 4 days. So I would make sure that we had easy food for at least the first 48 hours, that you could go downstairs, heat something up, bring it back to the cockpit, and not be cooking. By the end of any given passage, we would cook full meals in the galley, even at sea. But on those first couple of days, keep it really simple. So boiled eggs, granola bars, pasta that's pre-cooked, sandwiches, meat pies, like just anything you can grab easily and eat. And it wasn't so much an issue. The question was issue for ourselves or our visitors. For the most part, we kept visitors in pretty nice conditions, except once we had company in Banderas Bay, and it was a pretty, that was Mexico, pretty bouncy. So the easiest way to resolve that was to finish the day trip and head back to the dock.
To offload them. Certainly from a boat preparation perspective, navigation, the more work you can do that your boat's ready, the less you have to do things below decks the first few days. Some of the incidents where people have run into reefs, they didn't have a passage plan. If they're susceptible to seasickness, they may not want to go down and look at a bigger screen. They may not feel like doing a more detailed analysis. So the more you can do ahead of time, the safer you'll be. There was a good one there on features about the boat. And that's the dilemma I work every day, trying to help people find the right boat. For us, it was a boat with a great pedigree, so we were comfortable that it would be good offshore. And then once we were offshore, we saw that was absolutely true. It has a comfortable motion. It's robust. It doesn't have to be a super high performance boat. It has to just be robust, suitable performance, suitable space, load carrying capacity. Not only do the kids continue to get bigger, but their toy collections grow, my toy collections grow, tools, food. So just a big enough boat that'll look after you offshore. Book.
Somebody asked us if we've written a book. We haven't written a book yet, but it's not to say there's not a book that we could write one of these days. And then even just back to what did we enjoy about the boat itself? One of the things is when you're offshore and the seas, as we said, it's at least a minimum 2-meter sea state. The boat makes a lot of noises that it doesn't make at anchor. And those can be really disconcerting until you remember this boat is meant for these conditions. Sister ships have gone around Cape Horn. This boat is solid. She's going to be fine. She's going to get us there. And it just kind of gives you that peace of mind that it's a really solid boat.
Thanks, Amanda, for your comments.
And then, Maureen, there's no other typed questions. I don't know if you want us to answer any of them further or add anything else to what we've said.
And Victoria's here too. She can answer questions and give you an honest take of what was it like for kids.
Out of the mouths of babes, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Just let's give people just a minute. Is there any other questions anyone has? You can type them into the Q&A. Otherwise, we will close out. Okay.
Yeah, interesting when we've done the Blue Water Cruising Association ones, with presentations with people being so much closer to heading offshore themselves, the incredibly technical questions, which of course is always dangerous for a sailor. We could spend hours talking about electrical systems or plumbing or which is the best marine head, all those exciting things. So a little more general high level questions today. That's great.
And I guess I'll just say one last thing. There's a lot of people when we would come back in the summer and they would say, oh, wow, that's so amazing what you're doing. I'm so jealous, this kind of thing. And I guess I would say to anyone listening that if there's an adventure calling you, it may not be a sailing adventure. It may be just some kind of change in direction. Answer the call. It can be done. There's people who've done it before you. There's always a path that opens as you start to respond, but simply acknowledge I'm being called to do something else and see where that takes you. This is where it took us. Somebody asked, what do we do with the kids about school? We stayed as BC residents, which meant we could register for distance education, same as so many parents are doing now in British Columbia. So for several years, we were with Sides, a school here in Victoria. And then for the last half of the trip, we were with Self Design out of Vancouver.
Okay, wonderful. Did you want to just repeat how they can get in touch with you, just in case more questions or they want to reach out?
Certainly. Well, they can always leave comments on the blog. And during the boat show, for a lot of the boat show, I'll be working in the Yacht Sales West virtual booth. So that'll be open for chat. And I believe there's a button they can click on to send me emails as well.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, Max and Elizabeth. This has been a great presentation.
And I just see a couple more things there. Someone asked us about medical insurance. We always had it. We shopped around, chose the cheapest that gave us the coverage that we wanted. Dan, the Diver Assistance Network, is well worth looking at when you're headed offshore because they have it's a nonprofit extraordinary assistance. And someone's asked if they can rewatch with the kids. And I think, Maureen, that's over to you for, it'll be on the boat show website, eh?
Yes, so next week, all of the video content is available on demand. You just sign in as you did this week to the website. I'm not sure what exact day, but you can keep checking and you can watch all of the sessions that have been recorded on demand for the next 6 months.
And we'll be presenting again tomorrow at 3 o'clock Pacific time.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks again, Max and Elizabeth.
No, you're welcome. Thank you for the
It was
invite.
fun. Thank you. Fun to see all these people here. It's great.
And thank you for joining us today. We're interested in your feedback, either on this seminar or if you have ideas on topics that you would like us to cover in the future. Simply click on the Evaluate tab located just above the seminar description and complete the form. After the show, all attendees will also receive a post-show survey. Be sure to check out all of the features at the Vancouver International Boat Show Virtual. If you have a question, check out our info booth. We also want to thank our sponsor, Freedom Marine International Yacht Sales, and have a great time at the boat show. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.